On December the 7th, as you recall, we experienced Pearl Harbor. And so immediately several of my friends and I wanted to volunteer for active duty, but we couldn't because we were in a critical occupation in communications. So I had to get a release from the company. And a friend of mine, Jimmy Curtis, and I took the cadet exam to go into the Army Air Force. We both passed, and we were accepted as cadets. And they put us into what was then called the Enlisted Reserve Corps until the cadet opening came along. And I got a little impatient, so I wrote to the commanding general of whatever it was, some army out here in California, and asked for active duty. And he gave me active duty all right. He said to report for duty, to Fort MacArthur, and I would be assigned to the field artillery at Camp Hahn in Riverside, California. And I was. So I had to take the exams all over again. I requalified, and that took me through 1942, and in February of 43, I was ordered to report to Nashville, Tennessee for classification for training as an Air Force. I had hoped pilot. I made it through that. I went to pre-flight school at Maxwell Field, Alabama, where I qualified as a pilot. I was a cadet officer during each one of my training periods, the pre-flight, primary, basic, and advanced. I had very good ratings. I was 27th in a class of 600 of us started, 400 and some graduated. And I've forgotten the number now, it's in a book somewhere. I was 27th or 28th, and I was rather proud of that, being a high school dropout. I was sent to Avon Park, Florida, where I trained with the crew. I was a co-pilot. I was assigned as a co-pilot at that time. I met the girlfriend of my ball turret gunner, Catherine Beatty, and met her in Wauchula, Florida, and fell madly in love, and we were married in Atlanta, Georgia. We'd gone together for a long time, about 6 or 7 weeks, I guess it was. And we were married 3 or 4 days, and I went overseas as a co-pilot. And we flew, we were assigned 25 missions, about 18 or 20, number 18 or number 20. They increased that to 30, and we ultimately flew 30 missions, beginning in April and finishing in, I believe, August or September of 1944. Very heavy flying, very heavy flying. That was in the heavy part of the war. We did not have fighter escort other than just across the channel when we started flying. And by the time we finished, we had fighter escort most, if not all, the way. That did not mean that the same group of fighters would take us all the way. One group would take us to point A, and another one would pick us up and take us to point B, and sometimes we'd have as many as 7 or 8 different fighter groups that would fly escort for this long bomber train. The training in B-17s was interesting. You very seldom flew in training with all 4 engines. It was emergency procedures. You take off with 4 and lose 1. You take off with 3 and lose 1. You'd in flight have a fire and feather 2 of them. You couldn't get your gear down. You can't get your gear up. The radios don't work. The oxygen, you have an oxygen failure. We used to use glycol heaters in the B-17. We had to get rid of those in combat because glycol would flame at certain temperatures. And then you'd have a glycol failure, and all manner of things. The window would be blown out. The pilot or co-pilot would be blinded. The one wheel would go down and the other one wouldn't, or one would come up and the other one wouldn't. And it was always an emergency in the training. I was blindfolded and had to touch and identify, I think it was 141 or 114 gauges and switches and knobs and handles in that cockpit, and describe to the instructor pilot what it was and what it was for. So it was not not really easy. But I tell you all of that because when we got overseas, we flew several practice missions. We had to get familiar with English radio procedure and with English homing devices and navigation devices. And my first raid was to Friedrichshafen, Germany, which was one of the rocket or buzz bomb assembly plants. And it was an absolutely gorgeous day, and Friedrichshafen is in southern Germany, as you may know. And you could see the Alps, so beautiful. There was no fighter activity, very, very little flak. All 4 engines worked all the way. And I really was astonished and astounded at how much easier combat flying was than flying in training. That was until the next mission. But even all the missions were an exciting time for a young fellow. I was 21 when I went overseas. I checked out as a pilot after a couple of raids as an aircraft commander. And I recall on June the 5th, my birthday, 1944, I was 22 that day, we were awakened about 10:30 in the evening to brief for what became D-Day, June 6th, 1944. And that was a rather memorable birthday present. And we took off at about 2 or 2:30 in the morning, maybe 3, and it took an enormous amount of time to assemble. You must reflect here that to get 1,200 bombers in the air, in the right place, at the right time, at the right altitude, takes an enormous amount of planning and logistics, and they have to carry the right amount of fuel, the right amount of ammunition, the right bomb, or bombs. And to put all that together and get them to take off at 30-second intervals and climb out on a predetermined heading and assemble on a certain color of flare, red, 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 yellow, blue, green, blue, yellow, red, blue, whatever it was, that was your leader firing flares up through his stationary flare pistol in the ceiling of his B-17. And you would see that, and then you would get over there in the dark, no lights, because you have enemy aircraft in the air, and you'd be assembling on the flames coming out of the exhaust pipes of the B-17s ahead of you. That was thrilling. That was very thrilling, even as thrilling as combat. And once you assembled into a group then, and that group would be 3 squadrons of 6 aircraft each. You have 2 elements of 3 each in the lead squadron, that's 6 airplanes, 2 elements of 3 each in the low squadron and the high squadron. So that's 18 B-17s, 180 men in a group. Then you have 3 groups in a wing. Then you have 3 wings in a division. Then you have 3 divisions in an air force. And to assemble and get on track for your target at the right time, at the right altitude, in the right position, so that you're neither too far apart nor too close together, is an enormously complex and complicated undertaking. I don't think anyone appreciates that. I have the greatest and most profound respect for the people on the ground who did all these wonderful things about the timing and the loading and taking care of the machines and doing all this stuff that enabled us to do that. There were a lot of mid-air collisions. A lot of B-17s blew up on takeoff. A lot of pilots would become disoriented on takeoff and spin right into the ground. When we flew in a wing formation, that is, when we flew, we always flew in a wing formation and a division formation, but the wing commander had to have a qualified pilot as a tail gunner in his B-17, because the wing commander could not see behind him, and he had little or no idea of what was taking place with his wing and subsequent wings back in the bomber trail, or bomber train. So I was designated, after I'd flown several missions, to be the observer on one raid. So I flew as a tail gunner in a B-17, sitting on my legs for 9 hours, breathing oxygen. No, you can't get up and walk around. And it was a Berlin raid, and on takeoff, one of the B-17s down below us in a low group flew into another one, cut his tail off, and they both spun in and blew up. And I had to tell the wing commander what was going on. I had to tell him when we had fighters coming in from the rear. And we were attacked by fighters over Berlin, several fighters. And I squirted out several rounds with these twin 50s, but I didn't have enough azimuth or swing to the guns, and the fighters knew that. They stayed just a little beyond my azimuth, and all the other tail gunners' azimuth. But that was a different perspective on an air war, to sit in the tail gunner's position, than it was to sit in the pilot or the co-pilot seat and see what was going on ahead of you. I'd rather be in the pilot or co-pilot seat. But when we got back from that raid, true story, I had to be helped out of that tail gunner's position, which was cramped for a fellow my height, and I almost screamed when we straightened out my legs, and I laid there on the ground for quite a long time to get the circulation going before I could get up and maneuver. But that's all part of the combat experience. One of the memorable points in my combat, two memorable points, well, three really in my combat tour. One was a raid over Roulande, where one of the groups turned too soon and we turned too late, and we had to make a turn over the target. And so we were much too close behind the group ahead of us, much too close. And we saw them being blown up, parachutes coming out, burning gasoline, burning the parachutes, bodies tumbling through the formation. It was very, very horrendous experience.
Was that in Russia?
No, that was in Roulande, Germany, over Roulande, Germany. The Roulande was bombed several times. It was a major oil refinery. But that's the only time in my life that I honestly believed I was going to die. I didn't see how anyone could get out of that. We lost some people, not out of my crew, but in our group. We lost some people on that raid. That was a tough one. In fact, we were shot up, if I recall correctly, and had to leave formation on the way back across the channel and call for fighter cover, and we flew home alone. We threw everything out of the airplane we could get out and got back on two good engines. Another memorable raid was the shuttle raid to Russia, where we were going to drop bombs on a German target, land in Russia, eat, sleep, refuel, rebomb, drop bombs on a German target, land in England, eat, sleep, refuel, rebomb, and do this on a shuttle basis. And the Russians were responsible for our protection while we were there. And this was a raid on Poltava, and there was a book written about that called the Poltava Affair. We took 72 B-17s to Russia, and we brought 6 home. The rest were destroyed on the ground. We didn't lose all those people. The Air Transport Command came in and flew the people home. My B-17 was flyable, one of the 6, and we flew home through the Middle East, to Tehran and Cairo and Tripoli and Casablanca, and back to England. And I knew that when we got to England that we would be treated really as heroes, and that there would be great acclaim and much waving of flags and all that sort of thing. So we flew around Spain and France back to Land's End, which is the southwestern tip of England, and landed at a base that had a grass field. We had been given the radio codes and all the signals, and we were told by the tower to taxi to the farthest end of the field, and 2 British vehicles came out with medical personnel and guns full of DDT, and they squirted that stuff all over the airplane and up our pant legs and down our shirt collars and in our armpits and everywhere else, to be sure we didn't bring some terrible bug home from the Middle East. I can understand why they had to do it, but that wasn't the welcome that I had expected.
Where's Poltava?
Poltava is in the southern Ukraine, near a town called Meherod. We spent 10 days in Russia, 4 of them in Poltava and 6 in Meherod.
Was Poltava the target?
No, Poltava was where we were going to refuel
Oh.
and rearm and sleep and eat, and then go back to bombing Germany, but we couldn't do that. The Russians provided terrible, terrible defense. Their anti-aircraft guns were manual. There was no radar. They had P-39s, Bel Air Cobras as fighter cover. They were no good at night. The Germans had occupied that country for 2 or 3 years. The first flare, they didn't get dark till 10:30, 11 o'clock at night. Got light at 3 in the morning. The first flare, they low-level bombed and high-level bombed for quite a long time. We all ran out of our tents for the slit trenches that they had dug. I was the #1 man in a ditch and had 2 people on top of me. And they were dropping, they weren't after the people, they were after the airplanes. And we had lined those 2 B-17s up on steel mats on a grass field, 2 rows of 36 B-17s each, when a place else parked. And they destroyed 63 of the 72 on the ground. And we laid in that trench with 1,000-pounders going off out on the runways, maybe 2,000, 3,000 feet away. And the bottom of that trench would come up and hit you right in the face. There were most of the Russians were women, middle-aged to old-age women, and very old men. There weren't any middle-aged or young Russian women and men. They were either dead or in the service or on the front lines, which is only about 60 or 70 miles away. So we made it through the night. They sent women out to clear the butterfly bombs, and the Germans had dropped, I don't know how many thousands of anti-personnel butterfly. Butterfly bomb is a bomb that has wings on it. And if you touch it when it's on the ground, the spring is released and it jumps into the air about waist high and then blows you in half. And several Russian women were killed early the next morning as they were trying to clear the field so we'd get our flyable B-17s out of there. So we were taken by truck to Mehed Road, which was not very far away, must have been 15 miles or less, and we slept out in the bushes for 7 days and ate C and K rations, and then came back. ATC came in and flew out the people, the other 630 men, and those of us who could fly a B-17, who had B-17s that were flyable, flew them home through the Middle East on this trip back to England. The third memorable experience was my last raid. On the way home through the Middle East, my crew and I would pick up bottles of any kind of liquor you could get. And in Casablanca, you could get pink champagne, green champagne, blue champagne. You could get all sorts of strange concoctions. And we bought several bottles of several different kinds of concoctions and took it back to our home base with us. When we flew our last mission, we dropped supplies to the Spanish and French Maquis, and they were in the Pyrenees in southern France, and they were tying up 2 or 3 German divisions with guerrilla activity. Our drop zone was 3 fires on 3 hilltops about a mile apart, and we dropped from, I have it in my diary, my memory tells me about 6,000 feet. And here we had all these hundreds of B-17s, and we lined up in single file. And we would drop canisters of food, ammunition, liquor, medicine, supplies, bandages, small arms, all manner of things in this big triangle. And then they would come in and pick up these canisters. And then we reassembled from single files into our squadron and group formations and flew back north to England. And just before we got to the English Channel, we were over France, I called the group leader and I said, I'm having a little engine trouble, I'm going to feather #1. And I did, I feathered #1 engine. And I don't recall his exact words, but what he said in effect was, well, I've been expecting you to have a little engine trouble, have a good trip home. And so we peeled out of formation and came back across the English Channel about 20 feet high and across southern part of England up to our base perhaps 30 feet off the ground. We were scaring old farmers.
Okay, you're flying back on 2 engines and about 30 feet off the deck, and
We left you where we were coming home from a supply dropping raid to the guerrillas in southern France and in Spain. And since that was our last mission, the 30th mission, and we knew that we were going to get back all right, I called the group leader and told him that we had to feather one because we were overheating, and he kind of grinned on the radio and said, "I understand, I expected you to." So I feathered number 1, and we came home. We dropped out of formation and came back across the English Channel about, well, I'd say 20 feet, it might have been 100. And then we came back across England at a very, very low altitude. And we were going over farms and scaring farmers off their tractors and scaring horses and cows and scaring me a little bit. And we got back to base and we buzzed the control tower, and they knew what was going on. And we landed, and there was another crew. Winton G. Ramsey was a pilot. Very, very fine young man. He was killed on his, he went back for a second tour and he was killed later. But his crew finished at the same time, so we were both in the 561st Squadron of the 388th Bomb Group. And he had been on that Russian raid. And we were debriefed and went through our donut and tot of rum routine after a mission, and went back to the squadron headquarters, and we had a little lawn out in front of the squadron, about, I don't know, 10 feet by 10 feet square, something like that, a little grass patch. And so we all went and got all this crazy kind of booze that we had been buying for the last 15 or 20 missions when we began to believe we might finish and actually survive. And everybody brought out these concoctions that we had, and we drank it. And one by one, and this is a true story, one by one, the guys would either get sick or pass out. And the other crews that weren't finished yet were observing all this, of course, in a big circle and laughing and clapping and having a great time, very happy for us. It was quite a thing to finish. Losses were very high. And to finish 30 raids, literally unscathed, other than a few nicks from shrapnel, it was quite amazing. So they would carry the guys into their barracks, the enlisted men in one barracks and the officers in another barracks, and I don't know who carried me in, but somebody did. And that was all over.